Good afternoon, New York. I'm here to tell you three things. Drug prohibition doesn't work. It doesn't get rid of drugs, but it creates a massive black market that every single year profits the gangs that traffic with them $320,000 million a year. Declaring a war on these drug gangs or illicit trafficking also doesn't work. Why? Because it makes them prepare for conflict and it undermines the rule of law in the countries that actually dare to frontally fight them. But also, the third thing that I want to tell you is that militarizing that war will never end well. And I have the information to support my claims. This is a story of Mexico, a country that 13 years ago was living the lowest levels of homicidal violence in its history since it became independent. And only in a matter of a decade, we actually managed to make things worse. So I stand by this sign, and I have stood by it for the past decade as a human rights activist. It means no more blood. And this is basically the demand of the people in Mexico that had been using that sign to demonstrate against failed drug policies that not only fuel conflict and undermine institutions in our country, but that do so globally. Here at the Oslo Freedom Forum, I had the chance to speak and listen to the stories of my colleagues from many countries, going from the Philippines to Southeast Asia, to North America, to African countries, and other Latin American countries. We've all concluded the same thing. This war can't be won, and human rights will suffer a lot while we fight it. But it didn't used to be this way. I was born in a Pacific Mexico, part of the called free world, back in the 80s. And my reality wasn't so different than the reality that you guys live here in the United States. We had violence, yes. We had crime, yes. We had robberies. But we didn't have organized crime in the same magnitude as we have now. And we definitely didn't used to see the images that we just saw last week in Culiacan, Sinaloa. An entire city totally taken by drug gangs, menacing the government, and a government forced to retire. I wanted to become a diplomat when I graduated high school, when I graduated college. I wanted to, fight the fight of my generation, which was ending HIV, for example. I wanted to contribute to the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. I wanted a different life. But then reality happened. And in 2006, my government made the policy choice of declaring a frontal combat and an all-out war against drug cartels. That basically changed everything. So I decided to start to document the violence that was creating. And I started to join a movement advocating for drug policy reform, not only to have better drug policies that could actually help the people that use them, but to stop violence and to stop the increase on very important human rights violations that in many countries not only include censorship, but also include enforced disappearance, but also include torture, but also include extrajudicial killings. So I joined the global movement for drug policy reform back in 2011. And now I'm the executive director of a Mexican NGO that's at the front of this response. But what has been the impact of the Mexican war against drug cartels? Basically, it had fueled repression because we took the police out to fight not only drug cartels, but also the people that use illicit drugs. We took the police and then the military to fight the growers that are involved in the illegal trade. It fueled incarceration. I'm guessing many of you can relate to this because in the United States, drug policies also fuel incarceration of vulnerable populations and definitely have a racial bias. It also fueled an exceptional regime in which our law started creating more and more crimes, criminalizing more and more conducts and more people, mostly the most vulnerable. And we had disproportionate penalties to actually deal with the drug issue. So consumption that's not supposed to be illegal in my country can actually give you up to 3 years of incarceration if you're caught using drugs, no matter if it's marijuana or if it's cocaine. But it also started fueling police brutality because we basically declared this war and we enabled people to use stigma, discrimination, and force to fight a public health issue. Did you know that in Mexico, torture is actually authorized for the detention of people involved in drug-related crimes? Every single person in Mexico that's detained or arrested by the police for committing a drug offense has been tortured, including sexual torture, somehow during the arrest or the prosecution process. And it also fueled a different threat, the threat of militarization. We started using and overusing the army, the navy, every single enforcement agency that we had to fight this war. And the result has been disastrous. Not only because to start using the military, we needed to reform our laws and restrict ourselves from rights and freedoms and liberties in order to give those to the army and to the military, but also because we authorized these guys to basically violate our human rights in the name of a war that, I repeat, can't be won. But it is a policy choice, and this is what we're fighting. This man, President Felipe Calderón, who in 2006 declared this all-out war on drugs, is the main responsible for the levels of violence that we're living in our country. But it's not the only one. Sadly, the difference of this war that we're facing in Mexico is that it's not restricted to one personality. It's not about one authoritarian leader. It's about a global consensus that seemed to outsource conflict to the zones that are producer or transit countries without really taking the responsibility for it being a global issue. So other governments that follow had continued to use the same strategies and the same policies. What's the result? Well, I told you that back in 2006, we were living the lowest violence in our history. We were having only 8 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. What's the reality now? That rate tripled. Basically, you have a person killed at the global level for a drug-related operation or for drug use every single hour. This strategy is not helping people who use drugs. This strategy is not helping build secure countries or more functional institutions. And in Mexico, this particular strategy is causing a death toll of 2,000 people every single month, last year being the most violent year in our history. But it also increased the number of complaints against authorities for human rights violations. Again, from disappearance, to torture, to extrajudicial killings and executions. And this policy has been even taken to an extra level, to the next level of fully militarizing public security. This is the 10th year that we've been using the military to fight this in the hope that we will win it at some point. Again, we won't win it at any point if we continue to create a response that it's only punitive and that it's not designed to either help the people that are using drugs or really respond with intelligence, with compassion, with a comprehensive strategy to a phenomena that's much more complex than just bullets or just soldiers fighting the bad guys. But what are we using? What are we doing in Mexico? Well, the human rights movement, it's actually organizing. And it's organizing not only to make those costs visible, so audiences like you can understand that it can get really, really bad if we commit to this policy choice in very little time. We're also advocating for change at the legislative level. We're educating our decision makers. Drugs, yes, are not risk-free, but they can be dealt with in a different way. And we're also sensitizing Mexican audiences not to demand purely punitive responses to the drugs phenomena or to the insecurity phenomena. And we're litigating. We already won many cases at the Supreme Court that are demanding the Mexican government to change the strategy, regulate some drug markets, starting with cannabis, fully decriminalize drug use, and withdraw the military from public security tasks. But what do we need? We need you to unite. We need you to join this conversation, and we need you to also fight for drug policy reform here and in all of your countries and at the international level, because without the United States, without other countries joining this conversation, my government won't change its mind. And millions of lives are in the line here. Just so you have a very impressive figure, 300,000 people had been killed over the past 13 years. So what I want you to do today is to join this conversation. What I want you to do today is to count the costs of your own drug policies. And what I want you to do today is to join this marvelous human rights movement that's asking for change at the global level, because countries like mine can't take it anymore. Thank you so much.